Today we'll be talking about the skeletal system and more specifically about the bone structures and the functions of the tissue itself. And so the skeletal system itself is one of our major systems of the body, and it's always undergoing change. And so it's constantly in a process where it is breaking itself down and building itself back up. And so it's going through a process that we refer to as remodeling. And so it's doing this process dependent upon the stresses that we put on it, dependent upon the load that is on the bone at any given time, as well as the metabolic needs of the body for the minerals that it has inside. When we look at bones, the bones themselves are going to be primarily made up of the bony tissue itself. And so we have our connective tissue, which makes up the bone, but then we also have other connective tissues that are going to be featured with the bone itself as well. And so we have things like our cartilage. And so oftentimes in between the bones, we have ligaments from bone to bone, allowing for us to connect two bones and stabilize the bone and limit the amount of movement that it has. That's there. And then we also have connective tissue that just simply surrounds the bone. And so this is going to limit things like the amount of expansion or outward expansion of the bone at any given time. In terms of the cartilage that we have within bone, we see that we have multiple types that are found within the bones themselves. Essentially, at the ends of bones, anywhere where we have articulation between two bones, we're going to have this cartilage here called hyaline cartilage. That hyaline cartilage is essentially in between all of our joints. In certain areas, we need a little bit of extra protection in between the joints, and so we have what we call fibrocartilage. And so fibrocartilage we find there in between the knees as the meniscus. We find it in between the pubic bones, and so we have our pubic symphysis, and then we find it in between the vertebrae as the intervertebral discs. And so those ones are going to make up those components there. The hyaline cartilage, in addition to being in between the bones, we also find it as being here in the ribs, and they are what truly actually connect our rib to the sternum. And so that's the connecting point between the two is between those. It's not actually bone to bone. We have a large amount of cartilage there that connects between the two. So if you were to feel your rib cage just off of the sternum, you're going to be feeling the actual cartilage rather than bone. So even though it's as hard as bone, it's a very strong structure that's there. It is actually hyaline cartilage, not bone. And then we have elastic cartilage here. And so we have some additional cartilage that is not really associated with truly the bone per se, but elastic cartilage is there connecting our ears to the bone as well. So the whole idea of the skeletal system is one of the big things that it does for us is that it provides for protection. And so protection of all of our vital organs, our central nervous system, our soft organs that we have, so all of our heart, lungs, digestive tract partially is protected by there, partly the urinary tract system is protected there. All of those have some protection from the bony cage in a sense that surrounds them. In addition, it also provides for those same organs a place for them to attach to. And so it's going to provide for that framework, that support that those tissues need as well. The bones, especially those that are towards the bottom of the body, have to start to bear more and more of the body's weight. And so when you think about it, your heel bone, the calcaneus, has to actually be able to withstand all of your body's weight. Every time that you take a step, you land on your heel, and it's that heel bone that basically absorbs all of your body weight. If we throw in there doing things like running, now we get even further. And so we get an increase in terms of the amount of force that's actually being transmitted into that bone every time that our foot lands on the ground. As we talked about in the introduction to the systems themselves, we said that the skeletal system allows for a very efficient movement. And so it allows for our muscles to work in a more efficient manner by providing things like leverage. And so it provides for that ability to change the direction of pull that a bone or that a muscle has on the bone itself. And then lastly, we do things like storage. And so we're going to store adipose there. So we're going to store some energy. We're going to have blood cell production. We're going to store minerals within the bones. Lots of different things that we can save for another day within the bones themselves. That storage component is primarily in the terms of minerals. And so we're primarily storing minerals there, with the biggest amount of those minerals being calcium and phosphate. And so both of those are going to be stored in large quantities, primarily because the calcium gets stored away as calcium phosphate. And so we have a phosphate group available whenever we need it, because we need phosphate for ATP production. ATP is going to be our body's universal energy source. This is where it's going to get its energy from at any given time, is from ATP. We convert our food products that we have, the energy that's stored within the glucose and the proteins and the lipids, we convert that into ATP. And so we need to have a ready source of phosphorus in order to do that. In addition, the calcium that we have stored in the bone, we'll see once we get into other systems that we use it for muscle contraction. And so it's an important aspect of that. In a similar fashion, it's important for nerve impulses. And lastly, it's an important integral part of our blood clotting. The osseous tissue itself, when we look at it, it's made up of one of primarily three types of cells. And so we have osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. And so three different kinds of bones make up the majority of the cellular structures that are there. And then we also have osteoprogenitor cells. These are the cells that are going to turn into the other three. That's there. And so the bone, when we look at it, we can see in this example here of even lamellar bone that it is found in concentric circles. And so it kind of looks like a tree trunk. And so it has these concentric circles in there, and that's what provides for a lot of the strength of the bone that is there. In between the calcium and the phosphorus that's there, we have a large amount of collagen fibers, which are going to actually be enveloped by the calcium and the phosphate within the bones themselves. And so it's going to be part of the calcification process that occurs. So our cell types that we have our osteoprogenitor cells. Those are the cells that are going to give rise to our osteoblastic cells. And these osteoblastic cells are the cells that are making new bone. They're providing for the matrix that's needed in order to produce new calcified bone. When osteoblasts are kind of building, they oftentimes end up kind of painting themselves into a corner in a sense. They end up surrounding themselves by the newly formed bone. And when they do that, they get stuck inside. And when they get stuck inside, they become what are called osteocytes. Those osteocytes are now what we call mature bone cells. And so they're stuck inside in between the lamellae. They're inside what's called a lacunae, kind of a little pocket that's inside there. And those cells are now just simply going to monitor kind of what's going on with the bone itself. Osteoclasts are the last type of cell. These osteoclasts are cells that break down bone. And so they're designed to destroy the bone or reabsorb the bone. So they're going to create little resorption pockets that are inside the bone itself. One of the other big jobs that the bone does is the formation of blood cells. And so blood cells begin in the red bone marrow in terms of their production. And when the red bone marrow is stimulated to produce more cells by the production of erythropoietin, they're going to then start to produce those cells inside bone marrow. We find red bone marrow in the adult at the ends of long bones. And so in a particular kind of bone that we call a long bone, we're going to find the spongy bone there where we can make red bone marrow. We're also going to find it in places like flat bones and irregular bones as well. And so places like the skull and the hip. In the rest of the long bone, we have yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is primarily made up of adipose. And so we have energy storage here inside those long bones. In the young child, the entire length of those long bones is filled in by red bone marrow. And so it goes all the way from the ends of the bones, the epiphyses, all the way through the center of the bone, the diaphyses, and then all the way to the epiphyses at the other end is all filled with red bone marrow because they need to make lots and lots of new blood cells, not just to replace the ones that have died, but to replace the ones that are needed as the body grows. Bones can be classified based upon their shape. And so when we look at bones, one of the things that we look at in terms of naming them and things like that can be based upon the type of shape that those bones have. And so we have long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. Long bones, as the name implies, they're long. And so with that, they tend to have a bulbous end at either end of the bone. And so there's an expansion at either end of the bone called an epiphyses. And then the center of the bone is referred to as the diaphysis. And where the two of them come together in terms of where the epiphysis, in a sense, ends and the diaphysis begins, there's a small little pocket inside there called the metaphysis. This is also referred to as the growth plate. For our short bones tend to look kind of like little rocks. And so these are going to be bones that we find in places like the ankle as well as the wrist. They make up those bones there. So if we were to take one individual little bone out, it would oftentimes look like we had a little stone sitting there or a little rock. Flat bones are bones like the skull. And so many of the skull bones are flat bones. Essentially, they are made up of a small amount of cortical bone and then a large amount of lamellar bone or spongy bone on the inside. And they're flat. Although they're called flat bones, especially in the skull, a lot of the bones are actually curved to them. And then lastly, we have irregular bones. Irregular bones don't really follow a given shape. Typically, they have a lot of muscles that attach into them, a lot of ligaments that attach into them, and they provide for a large range of movements. So here we can see in our long bones, we have a epiphysis of the bone here. And so this end of the bone here, this is a growing child's bone or knee in terms of what we're looking at. And so all of this bone here is the epiphysis. All of this bone down here is the diaphysis. And then the space in between where we have this gap, this is the metaphysis. So this is the growth plate. In the child, it's open. So new bone is forming in that little space. In the adult, that bone is, in terms of the metaphysis, it's closed. And so it forms what's oftentimes referred to as a scar. And so this is where the two ends of the bone eventually came together and fused to one another. And as they did so, they left this extra thickened area within the bone itself. And so that's where we can tell kind of the difference between an adult and a child's bones. Inside the bones themselves, we have that concentric circles that I talked about before, and those are what we call lamellae. And so the individual rings that are here are the lamellae themselves. And so they provide for concentric circles within there. What they surround in terms of this entire circle structure here is what's called an osteon. And inside the little pockets, we have our little osteocytes. And so those are inside the little lacunae that are there. We then have things like our osteoclasts and our osteoblasts on the outside of the bone, breaking down bone and building bone up on the inside there. The individual osteocytes communicate with one another through what are called canaliculi. And so these little canaliculi are the little kind of like spider-like legs, in a sense, that are sticking out in between all of those osteocytes. And those are providing for communication in between each lamella that is there. and in between the osteocytes themselves. So they can communicate with one cell to the next. They can communicate in terms of allowing for the transmission of gases, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, as well as nutrients. The bones themselves are surrounded by connective tissue, and on the outside, the connective tissue is what we call periosteum. And on the inside, what we have is what we call, there's a layer that lines the very inside of the bone. This is called endosteum. And so endosteum is on the inside, periosteum is on the outside. Periosteum is 2 layers of connective tissue. And so we have 2 layers of connective tissue that's there. Endosteum only has a single layer. Endosteum tends to line the inside of our long bones here. And so as it lines the inside of the medullary cavity here, it provides for the protection that it needs on the inside. On the outside, the periosteum is going to do things like hold down blood vessels. It's going to allow for blood vessels to penetrate in through the outer covering of the bone itself. And it's also going to allow for muscles and tendons and ligaments to grab onto the bone, so that when we want to pull onto them, they have something to grab onto, and that's the periosteum. The osteon itself is the functional unit of bone. And so in compact bone, we have the osteon itself. And when we look at the osteon, so here we have the entire osteon itself, and we have the different layers of the lamellae that are there as well. And those different layers of the lamellae come to the very center where we have this central canal. And so we have this open space on the inside. That central canal is where we have blood vessels, so arteries, veins, we have nerves, we have lymphatics running up and down the bone itself there. Connecting one osteon to the next, we're going to have what we call Volkmann's canals, or perforating canals themselves. These are going to allow us to connect one osteon to the next. So one central canal to the next central canal in the next osteon. These are different from the canaliculi that connect one osteocyte to the next. Our spongy bone doesn't really look like that of the compact bone in that it has kind of this open weave to it. And so it has this open network on the inside, looking a lot like a sponge. And so we have all of these little individual trabeculae weaving back and forth inside, creating all of the space that's there. The spaces are filled in by red bone marrow on the inside. And individual lamellae have those similar concentric circles as well, making up the actual trabeculae themselves around the outside. This spongy bone allows for a lightening of the bone, so it's not as dense and not as hard and compact as that of compact bone. In order to form this bone, we need to do osteogenesis. And so this is the actual calcification process itself. And so we're ossifying the bones. We're taking typically connective tissue in the form of hyaline cartilage or collagen fibers, and we're depositing calcium salts called hydroxyapatites down onto the bone. This begins very early on in life. And so in the embryonic stage, we're going to begin this process right around 8 weeks. And so the process of forming the bone is going to be developing during this very early stage. And so all connective tissue begins as mesenchyme. And so that's its precursor for all of them. In bone, that mesenchyme then typically becomes hyaline cartilage. And then from the hyaline cartilage, we get the actual calcified bone in the end. In order to do this, we have 2 different processes that occur in order to ossify bones. We can do intramembranous ossification, and then we can do endochondral ossification. Intramembranous ossification occurs to basically all of the bones that aren't long bones. And so this is going to occur in the majority of the bones that are not long bones. And in this case, we're going to go basically from mesenchyme directly into bone. We're not going to replace all of that mesenchyme with another connective tissue, hyaline cartilage first. And so osteoblasts begin to lay down all of this yellow stuff here, which is new matrix, new formed bone. And that starts to fill in that space there where we have a ossification center. And in that ossification center, this is where the ossification itself begins. And we start to lay down basically solid bone. Osteoclasts will come in and start to take some of that bone away and start to form all of the trabeculae that are going to be found inside the bone. Eventually, the mesenchyme that's on the outside of the bone, so still out here on the outside, starts to coalesce as well. And this is going to eventually become the periosteum. And then we're going to be left with osteoblasts on the outside of the bone. The very outermost aspect of the bone is left as compact bone. So we still have compact bone here on the outermost crust, in a sense. And then the spongy bone is what's all filling the inside. Endochondral ossification has a kind of a intermediate step that occurs. And so we're going to go from mesenchyme to hyaline cartilage. And so we're going to generate a hyaline cartilage model of the bones themselves. It's kind of like making a scaffolding for all of the ossification to occur on. And so this process begins at about the same time in terms of development. And so this is going to produce essentially all the rest of the bones within the body, and primarily long bones. We get a primary ossification center starting to develop, and that primary ossification center starts to develop what's called a bone collar. And so we develop this outermost collar of bone first, and the primary ossification center starts to work towards the epiphyses of the bone. Eventually, the epiphyses start to ossify as well. And so we start to get ossification in our secondary ossification centers. And those secondary ossification centers start to grow in towards the diaphysis. So the diaphysis, the primary ossification center, is growing out towards the ends. The ends now start to grow towards the middle. And what we're left with is a growth plate. And so this epiphyseal plate here, or this growth plate, remains cartilage until the bone is done growing. And so essentially that bone is going to finish its growth somewhere between the ages of 10 to 25 or so, depending upon the exact bone that we're talking. All along, from the moment where we've begun that ossification process, we're always doing bone remodeling. We're taking some of that bone away, we're adding some bone in. We're taking some away, we add some of that bone in. Because when we're building a bone, in a sense, and we have kind of a bone something like this, and we eventually need it to be really, really big, something like that, we don't want the center of the bone to have just that little appearance. So it's going to have to grow out in width as well as in length. And so we're going to change the shape of the bone over time. If while that bone is growing, we put kind of some undue stress on the bone, instead of making kind of normal bone, the bone may even start to curve. So if that's like our hip bone there, it may eventually start to curve on us because of the stresses that's being put on it by the bone itself, or by the weight of the body. And so that's what we have here. And so this is a condition that occurs when somebody doesn't have enough calcium. And so this is what's called rickets disease. And so with rickets, they aren't getting enough calcium. That could be because they're not getting enough vitamin D either. But either way, it gives them a weakened bone, and the bone begins to, just under their normal body weight, it begins to curve. This bone should be nice and straight, but it's actually curved on there. And we can even see the fibula here is curved as well. And so the fibula is a non-weight bearing bone, but it starts to curve there also. So we need to have all the building blocks of bone in order to remodel it normally. This slide here just gives us a good idea of the remodeling capabilities of the bone. And so here we have a fracture. So nice transverse fracture. It's displaced. It's no longer in normal anatomical position. We can see that it's a child because their growth plates are still open. So we have growth plates there. And in this child, they were simply casted and then essentially left to heal. And so the first one there is at essentially the time of injury. The next one there is about 3 to 6 months later. And then the last one is 12 months later. And so you can see there where the bone has essentially taken itself back to a normal shape. And so it's remodeling the bone to get it back to where it's normally supposed to be in terms of its overall shape. One of the main reasons why the bone is able to remodel so well and do it relatively quickly, especially in the growing bone, if that was an adult, it would not do so in such a short amount of time. But one of the ways that it does so is that it's highly vascularized. There's a large amount of blood supply coming to the bone. It runs in through the medullary cavity here. So it's all along the medulla, or the shaft of the bone itself. That's there. We have our cortex, where we have blood vessels penetrating through nutrient foramen and getting into the inside. So larger blood vessels can go through those nutrient foramen and get to the inside of the bone itself. And then all just interspersed, all kinds of blood supply to the bone itself. And when you think about it, when somebody breaks a bone, they oftentimes have lots of bruising associated with it. And that's because of all of that leaking blood coming out of the bones themselves. Blood is one of the things that we need to keep coming to the bones in order to properly be able to remodel the bones. And one of the things that blood's going to bring us is things like hormones. And so things like growth hormone. And so throughout all of childhood up until puberty, growth hormone is going to be the primary hormone that controls growth of the bone. This is going to be the structure that allows for the bones to get the signal to grow, as well as the muscles and things like that. And growth hormone stimulates the production of insulin like growth factor 1, and this causes the growth plates to increase and expand. When we want to be able to control calcium levels, we have two hormones. We have calcitonin and we have parathyroid hormone. And so the two of them work in opposite directions of one another. And so as calcium levels rise, we get more and more calcitonin released. As calcium levels fall, we get more and more parathyroid hormone. So up here we're going to get calcitonin, down here we're going to get parathyroid hormone being released. And so the two of them are going to go up and down based upon the levels of calcium inside our blood. Once puberty sets in, the sex hormones are going to be our primary hormone causing bone growth. And then kind of the universal hormone as far as stimulating cellular production and metabolism of the cells is our thyroid hormone. So we need to have adequate amounts of it as well. We talked a little bit about the cartilage at the very beginning, and in between the bones, its main job there is to provide for a nice surface for the bones to ride along, so that we don't have bone-on-bone contact that's there. It also provides for basically the shape of the body. And so we get our overall body shape based upon the bony structures that we have as well. And so we talked about the types of the cartilage that we had. And so we have things like hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage, all doing different jobs within the body itself. Hyaline cartilage being in between the joints themselves, making up the nose there. We have elastic cartilage making up the ears. And then we have fibrocartilage absorbing lots and lots of shock and force in those areas of the body where we need to do so, the knee, the pelvis, and the vertebral column. Next up, we'll talk about the individual bones themselves.